Thanks for that nice introduction. So, this series of live stream sessions will focus on the importance of teaching cello technique and repertoire in a logical and organized manner. If you took a pedagogy course in college, you might find this to be a good review and hopefully some new ideas. If you never really thought about your own system of pedagogy, hopefully you'll find this of interest and stimulate you to think more about your own teaching. So this first session today will be an overview of the philosophy and the pedagogical background for this concept. The following 6 sessions in the next few months will explore how to apply this to teaching general exercises, bow technique, etudes, and repertoire in an organized sequence. Then at the end of the series, the last session, we'll do something that I call a self-examination checklist, a way to think about how we ourselves are doing as teachers. So I've told this story before, but it's sort of crystallized for me the importance of having a pedagogical system that covers all the essentials. A few years ago, I heard an audition by a cellist who had been a longtime student of the principal cellist of a major orchestra in the US. I was excited, thinking this young cellist who was applying to study at USC would be playing on a high level, having studied with such a wonderful performing musician. Unfortunately, his playing was a disaster. He played the first movement of the Haydn C major concerto. And when I asked him what technique he had studied, what etudes he had worked on, and what scale systems he used, he answered that he had only studied repertoire. It was clear that he had no fundamental understanding of tone production, intonation, shifting, or vibrato, except as related to that particular piece he was playing. He clearly didn't understand scales and arpeggios. There was no global knowledge of technique, which he could then apply to different styles of playing. And he was incapable of making informed decisions about interpretation, aside from copying what his teacher was doing in that particular piece. His teacher was of the mindset that one can learn technique through repertoire. So this is an example of what I call random teaching, where there's no sense of a grand plan or organizational principle to the teaching. Teachers like this have often had good training themselves and hence are playing on a high level, but they've forgotten how they themselves were taught when they were young. They want to work on an advanced level of artistry, but they don't remember that they themselves went through the process of learning technique by studying scales, doing etudes, and working on pieces that were appropriate for their level. Rather than having some sort of organized syllabus, they'll often assign pieces that they themselves are working on or just happen to react to whatever the student happens to bring in for the lesson. And often they're just teaching as a sideline to their main performing job with minimal focus on the real needs of the student. Learning to play an instrument is not unlike how we learn other things. We learn to crawl before we walk, and we walk before we run. Students studying math learn how to add and subtract before they start algebra, and they learn algebra before doing calculus. Similarly, string students should be able to play 2-octave scales and arpeggios in all keys from memory with a healthy sound and accurate intonation before they play the 3-octave Galamian system of scales. Cellists need to draw on a regular diet of Dotzauer, Lee, and Duport etudes before they play the Popper Opus 73 high school etudes, and they probably should play the 10 etudes of Popper Opus 76 before the famous Opus 73. And they definitely need to have played something like the Goldman G major concerto or the Böhmen symphonic variations before trying to play the Haydn C major concerto. This is what I mean by a sequential approach as opposed to random teaching. It's kind of like that cartoon of the ladder showing the importance of small steps. You can climb the ladder easily if you go one rung at a time, one step at a time, like on the left side of the cartoon. But if you try to reach too high, it becomes daunting. According to the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, the rhythms of education are in 3 stages: romance, precision, and generalization. Studies of successful musicians have shown that many of them have been taught by a succession of teachers who embody these 3 stages. The beginning teacher sparks the student's romance with the instrument and the inherent joy of music. This foundational stage is about nurturing passion and a love for learning. The second teacher is an educator and technician who instills precision and discipline and helps the student build a strong technical foundation, ensuring they develop the necessary skills to play proficiently. And finally, the artist teacher inspires artistic excellence, acting less as a strict pedagogue and more as a coach who elevates the advanced student to new creative heights. Nowadays, there are many excellent teachers for the first and third stages of a cellist development. They're wonderful teachers who are trained for teaching in beginning string and orchestra programs in the schools, and those who have benefited from the Suzuki method of teaching young cellists. And nowadays, the world is blessed with many wonderful artist teachers and performers who can inspire advanced cellists, give master classes, and teach high-level musicians. What is missing in the cello universe are competent, well-trained teachers for the intermediate level of teaching. So this series of live stream sessions will focus on the pedagogy for intermediate level students. The term intermediate student here means a young cellist who's played for a few years, perhaps having started in a public school or a Suzuki program. The student may be playing through fourth position and is motivated to become a better player, requiring individual attention. He or she is probably not very clear thinking about what they're doing technically and has not been exposed to the kind of self-discipline required for playing on a higher level. The term also might apply to an adult amateur cellist who either took lessons when they were young and then had life, or maybe just started in their 50s or 60s. The big picture is that the studio teachers for this level of student must be competent in many areas. Writ large, they must be knowledgeable about instrumental technique, about music in general, and they must be organized, and they have to understand how their students learn and think. Most importantly, they're responsible for establishing a good technical and musical foundation for the developing string player. This role includes providing a thorough understanding of left hand and right hand techniques, building good work habits, instilling self-discipline, and expecting consistency. The goal of creating a secure technical and musical foundation is achieved through a healthy diet of scales and arpeggios, exercises, etudes, and a gradual journey through the literature. Effective teachers must have good materials and clear sequencing. They must set high standards and have a clear understanding of how to teach all aspects of technique and musicianship. These teachers also have to be well organized, with short and long-term goals for the student. They have to plan week to week and month to month, as well as organizing recitals, competitions, auditions, etc., etc. They have to set standards for the students and help them to establish a code of self-discipline. They also have to be mentors for their students, caring and patient, and with the ability to help students deal with the inevitable frustrations that they encounter when learning something as complex as playing a string instrument. And sometimes they need to be counselors for their students. In short, they should be psychologists, physiologists, sociologists, and philosophers. And I'm sure that you can probably add some other areas of expertise that an effective teacher should have. Cello teachers for the intermediate level student must be far more than just good players on their instruments. They have to be good communicators who understand that the learning process and are aware of how the brain works. They also recognize different personalities and various styles of learning. There is so much material for a young musician to learn, and if the intermediate level teacher is not well organized, then some important material may be left out or forgotten. So this slide is from an article I once wrote listing some of the many topics that must be addressed by the teacher of the intermediate level student. It may be a little hard to see, it's kind of small, but if you're on an iPad or an iPhone, I think you can click on it and probably make it larger, but I'll read most of what's there. On the technical side, this involves a good foundation of basic fundamentals, such as the best placement of the instrument, the proper cello setup, and the basic bow hold, and then things like coordination, balance, strength, facility, speed, endurance, efficiency, flexibility, agility, concentration, relaxation, and sight reading. I know it's hard to read this, but I'm going to probably, I'll move it to another slide that makes it a little bit easier to see. So beyond those general things, specific issues for each hand must be addressed. For the right hand, things like basic tone production, bow distribution, bow strokes, string crossings, bowings, bow changes, and articulation. For the left hand, things like scales, covering all the keys, of course, arpeggios, speed, intonation, shifting, thumb position, double stops, articulation, pizzicato, vibrato, etc., etc. On the musical side, nothing can be taken for granted. The effective teacher cannot assume that even the most obvious issues have been discussed by past teachers or understood by the student. For example, the character of the piece, the use of rhythm, shaping phrases, the use of tone color, performance practice issues, style, having appropriate choices, having something really to say in the music. On the organizational side, teachers need to make sure that the student knows how to practice. That's obviously so important. How the brain works, how to memorize music, how to prepare for a performance, how to put together a recital program, how to work with an accompanist, and they need to know something about stage deportment. In addition, intermediate students need to be exposed to the important building blocks of music in order for them to truly understand what they're playing and to prepare them to make good musical decisions as mature artists. They must have a basic understanding of music theory and history, as well as an understanding of form analysis and at least rudimentary piano skills. And beyond all those things, the intermediate teacher must be a good communicator, and they must help the budding artist begin to develop a musical philosophy based on their knowledge of the world and their own life experiences. So how is this all possible? How can a teacher cover all the necessary material in the short amount of time that they work with a student? Of course, every teacher has their own style of teaching, and most teachers will work differently with different students. In addition, everyone has their own approach to pedagogy and technique. Nevertheless, the material should be covered in some kind of logical, sequential, and consequential manner, which may differ from teacher to teacher. Ultimately, it's the responsibility of the teacher to cover all this material in one way or another. The key for the teacher is that they must be well organized. Since it's the responsibility of the teacher to cover all this material, the teacher must be efficient with the use of lesson time. Too often, string teachers have no sense of a grand plan in taking the students through what they need in a particular lesson and throughout the year. There's certainly a place for the kind of improvisational teaching in which a teacher reacts to the moment or works on whatever the student brings in. This may occur in a one-time masterclass situation, or if a student comes for a sample lesson, or occasionally as the need or situation warrants. But if a teacher is responsible for the growth of a student for a period of time, it's important to have a clearly thought out plan for that student. Random teaching, as I call it, may result in important material never being covered. We expect our students to be disciplined and practice efficiently and effectively, but similarly, we have to be disciplined in how we best use our time with the student in the lesson. Since most students come just once a week for an hour, it's vital that this time is used to the fullest. In order to help organize the lesson time, I generally divide my lessons into 5 parts: warm-ups, exercises, scales and arpeggios, etudes, repertoire. I try to make sure that I spend at least some time on each of these 5 parts in every lesson. If I neglect to touch any of these items in a lesson, then the students will assume they do not need to spend their time on this in practicing. If they know that their scales and arpeggios and exercises have a high priority in the lesson, they'll make sure that they come in prepared. In the beginning of the semester, I probably spend more time on the scales, arpeggios, and the exercises. As the semester progresses, I spend more time on the etudes and pieces. Since intermediate level students generally prefer to work more on their repertoire, I need to send them a strong message about the importance of scales and exercises by letting them know that we'll always begin the lesson with these. I find that the consistency of this plan is actually comforting to the students. There's no real discussion about what to start with in the lesson. They begin with their scales and exercises and then feel ready to tackle their etudes and pieces. So there's no surprise at the beginning of a lesson. It's a regular routine. And there's even a little ritual that I do when I move the music stand away as they tune so that when they perform the scale and arpeggio, there's nothing to hide behind. They become accustomed to this and they feel actually less anxious when they're performing other music by memory without anything between them and the audience. The regularity of this routine feels as normal as brushing one's teeth in the morning. The purpose of each of these 5 parts of the lesson should be quite obvious. I'll talk a lot more about each of these parts of the lesson in the following sessions over the next few months. This next slide presents a very rough oversimplification of a global syllabus. The point is not in the details, but just showing that there is an overall plan for an intermediate cello student. Notice the way that the technique and the etudes interact with the pieces. So one of my principles is that we should always be playing repertoire that's easier than the technique we're working on. This is so that a cellist doesn't struggle with a piece technically, and so they can think about and work on the music itself. So in order to squeeze as much as possible into the lessons, I've found that it's helpful to use the following procedure to help me and my students keep organized. So first of all, I think it's important for the students to have an assignment notebook so there's no confusion about what they should prepare for the next lesson. I usually write in the notebook myself. I find it saves time because I can actually write faster than they can. And I also write while they're playing often. So my handwriting is atrocious, but they can read it well enough so that it jogs their memory when they go home. I usually don't write down detailed information in the practice in their notebook, just the bare bones of the assignment. However, sometimes during the lesson, I'll hand the notebook to the student in order for them to write down details about what we discuss. People seem to remember things better if they write it down themselves. So here's an example of a page from one of my students' notebooks from a few years ago. Notice the horrible handwriting, my handwriting, and the shorthand I used to write quickly. If you can see it, you can see the date, the open strings. They were working on a B scale and arpeggio, so ARPs I write, it's my abbreviation again for arpeggios. And down the page, number 36 there refers to the Fourier number 36 exercise, and then Lee etudes number 18 and 19, and some things I wanted her to look up regarding the similarity of number 19 to bel canto overtures by Rossini, Bellini, and Donizetti. I often request that the students keep a practice chart to help them organize their practicing. This also helps me to evaluate their time usage at home and is a useful starting point for a discussion about practicing. Once the student understands the basic principles of good practicing, I usually don't ask for these charts anymore. So here are a couple of charts that I've used in the past. Usually I'll start with something rather simple, what I call a what and when chart, and the students keep it in their notebooks. And then this is an example of a chart that I've sometimes used at a short music festival where the students have a small amount of time to practice, but can accomplish a lot if given the tools to be organized. For example, when I taught at the Governor's School for the Arts in the summer, I would often give the students this kind of a chart, dividing the practice time into half-hour chunks, where they'd have to write down their goals on the left there and whether they're able to accomplish them in that amount of time. It would help them set realistic goals for a half hour and then help them evaluate if they really completed their goals. Another version of that was even more specific. They would write down their goals for the day at the top of the box there and then divide their practice time into 10-minute segments and then write their goals for those 10 minutes in those lines and then their report. They didn't need to write a novel in their report, just a quick self-evaluation. So nowadays I tend to use online technology with Google Docs. That way I can even take a look during the week to see how students are doing and intervene if necessary. So I'll say, please spend more time on your etude and less time on your Fourier exercises or something like that. So here's an example from my granddaughter, Zoe, who's a cellist in high school in Toronto. She's supposed to do 2 45-minute sessions a day. You can see each day is divided into 2 there, working on warm-ups, scales, Fourier etudes, Fourier exercises, 2 etudes, and 2 pieces. At the bottom, it automatically adds up the time. So the efficacy of using these practice charts became clear to me many years ago when I had a student who came to me in ninth grade without much cello background. After 2 or 3 lessons, I asked him to do a what and when practice chart like I described before. He did it and it looked good. You can see it here. My horrible writing is at the top and on the sides, and he filled it in with his open strings, scales, arpeggios, exercises, dots or etudes, and his square piece. And after a discussion about practicing, I really never asked for a practice chart again from the student. But this student kept studying with me for 3 more years and made really remarkable progress during that time, and was then accepted by the San Francisco Conservatory for college, and he studied with Bonnie Hampton there. In his last lesson in high school with me, I congratulated him on his diligent work and asked how he kept himself so disciplined. Well, he brought out a thick notebook in which each page was an entire week of practicing using this what and when model. So this was a complete surprise to me. I had no idea that he had been keeping the practice chart. But he himself recognized that this system worked well for him, and it enabled him to make regular daily and weekly progress. The student, by the way, was Teddy Buchholz, who some of you may know is the cello professor at the University of Arizona, and is actually my co-author of the scale book that we recently wrote, The Cellist's Guide to Scales and Arpeggios. But this was proof positive that the practice charts can help. And that the students, if they take it to heart, can really make good progress by keeping the charts. I believe that it's important for students to develop the skills of memorization by learning and performing music from memory on a consistent basis. The key is consistency. The brain is like a muscle. If it's exercised, it grows stronger. I ask my students to exercise their brains by memorizing something every day, and then to perform from memory in the lesson each week. Starting every lesson with a memorized scale and arpeggio also helps to create an atmosphere of focus and concentration right from the start. I don't know how it is in Britain, but in the United States, schools don't ask for much memorization anymore. I can still recite a few poems that we had to learn when I was growing up, but my father, who grew up in the 1920s in Germany, had to memorize a huge number of poems by Goethe and Heine and Schiller. And at the dinner table, while I was growing up, he would recite large tracts of Goethe's Faust, and it was very impressive. Great brain training for him. We don't really have time to talk here more about memorization right now, but there are techniques such as chunking, which are very useful for musicians. So we could do a whole session on techniques for memorization. Next, I expect to see penciled markings in the music from the students, including metronome markings, bowings, fingerings, and especially also English translations of any words, and any special notes about bow distribution, dynamics, tone color, etc., etc. When I look at the students' notes written in the music, I can tell a lot about what they're actually thinking about, even before they actually play, which saves a lot of time in the lesson. Regarding metronome markings, I asked the students to write in their goal tempo in a box at the top of the page, indicating how fast they imagine that a particular etude or piece should go. I let them determine this goal by themselves, but then discuss it with them in the lesson to see whether it's realistic or if it's true to the composer's intent. It's also interesting to see whether they understand how a tempo in 6/8 can be felt in eighth notes or in a dotted quarter, but not in quarter notes. Understanding pulse and rhythm is an important part of understanding the nature of a piece of music. Incidentally, I'm really amazed that young people today can't seem to do the math in their heads. If they have a tempo, say, of quarter note equals 120, and I ask them what the half note would be, they often have a hard time dividing by 2. But I insist that they work it through, and after a few weeks of doing this, they seem to be getting better in math as well as music. And by the way, as an aside, I think that the self-discipline that students learn through music can be really helpful in other areas of life. I had a pre-college student who studied with me for a few years and was then diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 14. She had to learn how to monitor her insulin levels and give herself shots. And when she graduated high school, her doctor told her how impressed he was with her. He said he never had such a great patient who never got into any medical issues because she was so disciplined. She told him that she learned about self-discipline from her cello lessons and from practicing. And today she's a cello performer and teacher in Atlanta, Georgia. So back to metronome markings. Here's an example for one of my students' Lie etudes as an example. You can see the gold tempo in the box on the left, and you can see she imagined 90 to the dotted quarter note. And below the gold tempo, she wrote down the actual tempo at which she was able to play the etude when she first started playing it through. In this case, it was like at 60. Then she wrote her tempo markings down the left side of the music as she got faster and faster up to the gold tempo. I often ask the students to snap their tempo before their playthrough so that I know that they have a good idea of how fast they should actually be able to play it before beginning. That way, if they're nervous and about to play too fast, they can correct the tempo before starting to play it in the lesson. This saves time in the lesson and also stresses the importance of internalizing their tempos before playing. You can see here how this student went to some extremes with writing in dynamics and phrasing, etc. I certainly don't expect that much written in. This was early in the process of studying with me, and shortly after this Lie etude, I started really weaning her from writing quite that much. But it certainly helped her, and she studied with me for a few years, and recently just played the Elgar Concerto and a complete Bach suite from memory in her senior high school recital. And she's now a freshman music major at a major university in the United States. So I find it really important to have regular master classes for the students. It gives them medium-term goals for preparing etudes or pieces that they're working on. I do twice a month master classes for my pre-college students and recitals at the end of each semester. For the college students, I held weekly master classes. This helps keep the students focused on making progress and helps them recognize the progress in their colleagues. In recent years, I found that I can save a lot of time in the lesson by using modern technology. I'll sometimes ask a student to send me a video to pass off an etude. But the caveat is that I'd like to see their best possible performance. Usually the student will decide to record the etude multiple times before sending it to me, and as a result they watch themselves and set higher standards as they recognize their own issues or problems. They send me the video through Dropbox or private YouTube, and this way they also have a record of their own playing for future reference. The minimal amount of time it takes for me to watch this performance outside of the actual lesson is well worth the marked improvement in the student's level of playing, and results in increased self-awareness of their own intonation, rhythm, musicality, and so forth. This is one of the best pedagogical innovations using current technology. So next I want to mention a few guiding principles for string teachers. There are obviously lots of different teaching styles, and here are some principles and philosophies that are probably important for all of us to help keep track of what we're doing and where we're going with our students. So first of all, understand the basics. It's obviously important to know and understand the technical and musical principles that we want to convey. That's priority. We need to know as much as possible about every aspect of playing the cello and about music in general. And we often need to have several different tools in our toolbox for conveying the same ideas. For example, if we're talking about playing with a straight bow, we need to explain it and show it in 20 different ways. And hopefully something will gel with the student and they'll get it right. For example, if I were talking about the bow being the straight bow, I could talk about the bow being parallel to the bridge, or the bow being perpendicular to the strings, or how the hand has to move away from the body on the down bow and the tip will be away from the body. It's because of an optical illusion. We're not straight behind the cello, we're a little bit off, and so forth. And that we could bow in an arc, that's another way of saying it, or we could hold the bow with the left hand and move the right hand along the bow to find where the arm has to be there. Or we could use a damper mute and put it on and then bow along the damper mute to make the straight bow. And of course you have probably other ways, many more ways of conveying this idea. But the idea is that one has to have lots of different ways of communicating the same idea. Next, work from large to small. As a general principle, I think it's important not to start with the small details, but rather with the big picture. For example, an artist who's making a sculpture, he takes a hunk of marble and doesn't start with getting all the little details of the eye, say, but rather gets the broad outlines of the shape of the body or the head. For us, I think it's preferable to work with the large muscles first and then the smaller muscles. In other words, get the basic bow arm, upper arm, lower arm stuff figured out before working with the wrist and the fingers. I don't even generally work with the actual bow hold until a few lessons in, and I'll explain more about that in another session. But even something like the basic sitting position, it's really important to start with that right away. And since children tend to grow over the summer, when you may not have seen them for a while, I always start the first lesson of the fall with looking at how they're sitting and to see if they grew and if the end pin actually grew with them, or if they're holding the cello too low as a result. Next concept is introduce concepts and reinforce with exercises, use in etudes, and then apply to pieces. This is the basic outline for introducing new techniques. Using the example of the bow parallel to the bridge, over time I keep coming back to making sure that this concept is deeply ingrained. But I start with the concept itself in the very first lesson. Then I reinforce it with several exercises, and then I keep watching for it in the etudes, and hopefully by the time we're working on the repertoire, I won't have to correct it. But if we do, we go back to the concepts and to the exercises. Next, find patterns. Music, as we know, is filled with patterns, and it's helpful to show students how to find these patterns and use them. For example, learning the patterns in the 2-octave Foyar scale and arpeggio system is invaluable for knowing how to play in the neck positions and finding good fingerings and enhancing sight reading. One has to ingrain these patterns in the body and mind through repetition and memorization and study, but once they're there for life. Practicing classical shifts as well as romantic shifts gives us the ability to do both, and then of course we choose. Next, very, very important, obviously, the art of practicing. It's essential to make sure that students know how to practice efficiently and effectively. I could spend the entire session here on that topic of how to practice, but students often need our help to figure out what works best in practicing. I actually spend a lot of time in lessons showing and talking about how to practice well. We're with the students for just an hour a week, but they are, of course, by themselves practicing for countless more hours. And if they don't know what to do, really, then they won't be making good progress. I often tell the students to pretend that I'm there with them in the practice room and to imagine what I might say. Sometimes I actually loan the students what they call the Jesselson doll, which sits staring at them during their practicing to make them think that I might be there with them like a fly on the wall, watching and evaluating how they're practicing. It really does work. So next, don't go on to the new thing until the old idea is firmly established. I think it's critical that we build on a concept before starting to layer new ideas. In other words, that we have the basic concept down pat before breaking the rules. For example, again, with the bow angle, I want to make sure that the student knows how to play with a core sound, bow parallel to the bridge, before working with ideas such as changing the contact point by changing the angle. I could change the angle on purpose and then go back to parallel to the bridge, but that's a rather sophisticated concept to do that, as opposed to just pushing the arm down. And I want to make sure they know how to play with the bow parallel to the bridge before going to that. Next, pick appropriate literature. The basic rule is to pick literature that's easier than the technique the student is working on. I think it's really important to make sure that the student has the necessary technique when working on a piece, so they're able to focus on the musical elements of that piece rather than necessarily the technique. Every piece, of course, will obviously have some technical challenges, but if the piece is too difficult to master technically, then the performance will suffer because the student's attention will be on the technical problems. The same is true with etudes. It's not in the student's best interest to be working on proper etudes if they don't have the background to approach being able to conquer the challenges that are being presented. Next, promote consistency. in lessons and in practicing. One of the issues we all face as a society nowadays is the short attention span of the younger generations. Music and lessons can actually help address this issue because of the focus required, but only if we actively combat the problem by insisting on consistent lessons every week and consistent routines of practicing and concentrating. We can start small, maybe memorizing just a few notes of a scale, and then building on that with a full scale, and then a short piece of a phrase in a piece, and then an entire memorized movement of Bach. But the practicing and the work should be consistent, not sporadic. Next, create good goals for a student. There should be clear week-to-week goals, as well as midterm and long-term goals. The goals should include the amount of practice time you expect from them every day, or every week, or how many etudes the student will get through in a semester, or how many times they play in class, or doing a competition, etc. The goals should be agreed upon by the student, of course, and preferably in advance of starting the lessons. Next, don't teach just one movement of a concerto or a suite. I'm not sure that everybody here will agree with me on this, but I believe that it's not good to teach only one movement of a Bach suite and then move on, or one movement of a concerto. I believe that piece is not finished unless the whole piece is learned and performed with piano, if there is, of course, an accompaniment. So before starting the Haydn C major concerto, I think it's important to ascertain whether a student will be able to conquer the third movement, and maybe even start with that movement to make sure. Next, use entire etude books, not just selections. Again, some people may disagree with this, but I'll talk more about my reasoning for this in an upcoming session on etudes. I'm not a fan of the Schroeder type of compilation of etudes. I think it's important to take a deep dive into all the Lee Book No. 1 etudes, and all of the 12 Franchomme caprices, and all of the Popper 76 etudes, rather than just one or two samples. The reason for me for this is so that the students spend a good bit of time absorbing the essence of each of these composers. For me, the Dazauer, for example, focuses a lot on basic technique. The Lee focuses on classical phrasing and style. The Duport begins to concentrate on integrating the upper and lower registers of the cello. And the Franchomme is like Chopin-esque and a great way to prepare a student for playing cadenzas. So each book has an overall raison d'etre, and it's good to just really delve into whatever that is with a budding cellist. Next, use questions rather than telling a student things. I feel it's more beneficial for students to try and figure out things for themselves rather than me telling them things. In other words, using the Socratic or the Talmudic method of asking questions. Another approach that can benefit the students is something called experiential learning, in which someone gains knowledge and skills by exploring things and discovering things by themselves. So when I give a student a new piece, I want to have them sketch it by themselves before I show them anything. That means putting in their bowings and fingerings, figuring out the rhythms, and even exploring the dynamics and phrasing. Of course, I'll then help with fingerings or whatever else is needed, but I don't want to give it to them all in advance. I never give them my music to copy because I want them to figure it out themselves. I love it when a student creates a fingering that I never thought of and it works well. I learn from my students all the time. And finally, my real goal is to ultimately make myself unnecessary, in that students will be able to learn and discover things by themselves. I want to give them the tools and the techniques to solve new problems that inevitably come up in a new piece. They'll only study with me for a few years, and they won't have a teacher all their lives. So if they're not properly prepared, they won't be able to continue to learn once they leave school. I consider a lesson a good lesson if I really don't have much to say to them. If the student has worked hard during the week and figured out lots of stuff, then I can just sit there and offer praise. That's the best kind of lesson. The goal is really to prepare the students for a lifetime of learning. So today we had an overview of this sequential approach to teaching, and at this point I should stop and take some questions or comments. But next time we'll talk about warm-ups and exercises, and I'll spend a few minutes on the importance of the very first lesson in setting up expectations and goals. In the third session, we'll discuss a wonderful way to teach the whole range and gambit of bow technique. which is using the Foyer daily exercises, which is kind of my cello Bible. Next, a sequential approach to teaching uh, scales and arpeggios based on my recent book, Cellist Guide to Scales and Arpeggios. And then a discussion of the importance of etudes and a full syllabus for teaching etudes covering various technical and musical aspects of cello playing. After that, a sequential approach to repertoire, and I'm going to ask for your help in that session with identifying some effective pieces that are less often used. I'll ask you to send me some examples in advance, and if possible, a link to a video that we can show, either one that's on YouTube or one of you playing yourself a piece, or have a student play a piece that's not commonly known. And finally, in the last installment, I'll present a string teacher's self-examination checklist of things to think about in your own teaching. So I know I spent the whole time today just talking without playing a single note, but in the next couple of sessions, I hope to do some playing. I will do some playing and actually demonstrating some cello stuff. So I'm happy to take questions, hear your comments. If we have any time at the end, I can play a short video of a piece I just recorded, and we can check to make sure that the videos will work on this PowerPoint for the future. And I'm happy to stay. I know I went a little bit long today, longer in talking than I wanted to, but I wanted to present the overview today. So I'm happy to stay on if anybody wants to have a discussion or talk.
Jeff.
I see some note that says Jeff Solo. Hi, Jeff. I don't see you yet, but raise his hand. I don't know how to.
I think he's unmuted himself.
Oh, okay. Can
I
you?
have, and I also enabled my camera, I thought.
Yeah, we
Okay.
can see you.
I can't because I'm on the PowerPoint still. Maybe I can get out of that
Oh,
somehow.
Uh,
Anyway, go ahead.
I was just going to observe in agreement that to me, my biggest pet peeve about Suzuki is uh, separating the repertoire into individual movements scattered among different level books so that people regularly unless they've changed that. I mean, I haven't kept up with all the more recent iterations, but it's always bothered me that you would have one movement from a piece in one book and another movement in another book. Uh, and I'm always kind of surprised when one of the things that I give new students is a blank repertoire chart and ask them to write down what they've worked on, divided into scales and etudes and different categories. And so often I see movement one of this and movement two of this. And actually, on my sheet that I give them, I also ask them to note if it's been memorized and or performed.
I do something very similar, yeah. But I make it clear always when we start a piece. I mean, they know my policy. Everybody knows my policy that if we start a piece, we're going to do the whole piece. So, yeah, I don't want to get in a big discussion about Suzuki, which I value tremendously, actually, as especially the beginning stages, the first couple of books and so forth. I think is terrific. My granddaughter in Toronto went through the Suzuki method, but I think after the first couple of books, that's when it becomes a little bit more problematic with these one movement concerto, the Goldgerman concerto, which has a cut in it, and it's not the whole first movement, or what is it, the third movement,
third movement.
things like that. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. That was a splendid presentation. Thank you so much. I wonder if other people found the charts difficult to read on your PowerPoint. And would you consider assembling maybe there was one at the beginning, one towards the middle? I think we can go through it and decide. But if you could assemble it as a PDF and send it, then there's too much valuable information there to lose. And
Yeah,
we
happy
weren't
to do
able to
that.
make notes because we couldn't really see it.
I totally understand. And,
Yeah.
some of you and I tried a couple of different ways of doing the PowerPoint thing.
Yeah.
This was the best we could come up with right now because we
Yeah.
can't go back and forth very easily. But I'd be happy to share the whole PowerPoint thing if anybody wants it. I don't know how we would do that
Definitely
exactly.
the charts
Yeah.
that were detailed and small that just could not be viewed. So
Okay.
you and I will get together and we'll go through it. But thank
Yeah.
you so
Good.
much. There's some other hands that went up. I think Ava Johnson. Ava, would you like to ask a question?
Oh no, Selma, I was just agreeing with you about the charts.
Oh, I see. Okay, great. Lovely.
Happy
Thanks
to
so
do that.
much, Bob.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed.
Mhm. Okay. Any other questions?
Jeff, I think
I have,
raised his
but yes,
hand here.
I have one more. Uh, my biggest problem with a really organized sequence of presentation like this is I generally don't teach high school age students. I teach students primarily who have come to me through Temple University, and I would say that 99% of them are remedial. And depending on, how remedial they are in which areas, uh, I find that being really systematic with repertoire, if someone has terrible bow issues with tightness or something, they essentially end up digging their grave deeper and deeper, and one has to address their physical issues before any kind of sequential progress.
I totally agree, but and I know teaching at USC was very a very similar situation. So I would get college students who were playing already complicated pieces, but it was clear that they were missing very fundamental things. And so what I would do with that is I would take them back in the beginning and make sure there are no holes in understanding. When I talk about, let's say, core sound, what do I mean by core sound? The bow parallel to the bridge. I was amazed that sometimes people didn't understand that, or how you do a shift or whatever. And so I would go back to those earliest stages, but then I would still do it in a sequential way. So the bow technique, for example, I would train. I'll talk about that in a couple of weeks in within another session. But I would train using the Foyer number 32, number 33, number 34, number 35, number 36, and really go through all of that sequentially because it doesn't, but it covers everything. And for basic bow technique, then you go on to the Sevchek, of course, which Selma and Josh did so fantastically in a few months ago.
So how do you deal with doing that while the students have to play difficult orchestral repertoire and have a chamber music assignment and they have juries at the end of every semester?
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate that I could choose what they would have to do, let's say, in their juries. So they didn't have to play the Schumann concerto. I could give them the Golderman concerto, let's say, if that was where they were, and the rest of the jury was okay with listening as long as it's memorized, and it was a competent job. Then obviously we wanted them to play as well as they could, and yeah. I almost always, even I'll tell you, even master's students and doctoral students would come really playing on a high level, but the holes in their playing was their understanding of how to teach these things. So I would often go through some of these basic things even with them, even though they did know a lot about this stuff, but they didn't know, they had forgotten how they had learned it. And so if I go over it with them about how one teaches it as well as making sure they're doing it right, that was giving them, I think, a big thing. So one of my doctoral students actually wrote his dissertation on this sequential approach. And it's available actually on my website and for free. Not pushing anything. But he was impressed with the way this worked for him and the students in the studio, and so he wrote a dissertation on it.
I will check it out. Thanks.
Okay. Hey, Jeff, I'm very impressed that you, of all people, are here. Thank you so much for, have respected you for years and years and years, and
Well, I'm always interested in and learn from what you have to say and offer.
appreciate it.
Lovely. Are there any other questions? Well, I think we have a good grounding for the next 6 sessions,
Yeah.
and people can certainly come with their personal questions and their challenges in their own teaching. I think that's important to bring up that point that Bob is not just here to tell us what he considers to be a sequential approach, but would value your contributions. And during the weeks between sessions, if issues arise or questions you have about staging certain kinds of learning. For example, I use chunking in my own teaching, and I think that I would flag that as a very useful concept to bring up and explore in future sessions. I have
Great.
I have something I call making chunks and making chiclets, and chiclets are the little bits of the chunks. But I'm delighted to hear that you practice the same thing. I don't think we've ever talked about it, but just coincidental brain.
Yeah, yeah, lovely.
So
And I'm
things like
happy
that.
if people feel like emailing me with questions or want to continue a conversation by email or message or something. I'm happy to do that. So my email, I was going to put it on the PowerPoint thing, but I'm out of the PowerPoint now, so I can't put
I
it there.
can put it in the chat,
Oh, okay, yeah.
in the group chat, I think.
My email is rjesselson
Yeah, I just,
at
oh, just lost it. Hold on one second. I'll just bring up the chat. Why isn't that opening? Oh, there it is. Okay. So it's,
rjesselson at Mozart, very hard to spell, of course,
mhm.
dot sc, like South Carolina, dot sc dot edu.
Okay, shall I send it? Yeah. Okay, it's in the chat.
Great.
Lovely. Well, we're all ready for either supper or a drink. A drink,
No,
and you you're not.
I'm ready for a lesson and then a cello class and then another lesson.
Yeah, that's an American cellist Sunday. It's work.
A retired American cellist, right?
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing your time today.
Thanks,
I
Selma.
look
Thanks so
forward
much
to
for
seeing you in the
inviting me.
next one. Yeah.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye bye.